Hello and welcome to Ask an Author with Julia Kelly. I am joined by an incredibly special guest, Allison Pataki, the author of this wonderful, beautiful book, The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. Welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm thrilled to be here.
We are doing things a little bit differently today. We're on YouTube rather than on Facebook, but we're still going to have the questions that we would always have. We're going to dig into the book and really get kind of a behind the scenes spoiler-filled look at what's in this wonderful, wonderful book about a pretty incredible woman. So I'm going to start with the question that I think most people, before they got to your author note, probably wondered, which is, how did you come to write this story about this woman?
Absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. And the story behind the story really begins 6 years ago. I met a friend of the family. At that point, I had written 3 books about these fascinating leading ladies from history who had sort of been on the sidelines of the historical record. And what I had tried to do was pull them to center stage and really tell novels that were their big stories. And so at that point, this friend of mine who had read my books said, what do you know about Marjorie Merriweather Post? And I will be honest, at the time, I did not know much about Marjorie Merriweather Post at all. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but I thought maybe somehow connected with the Emily Post Manners books, or maybe a Post newspaper out there somewhere was a connection to her. But I didn't really know much at all. And the friend just gave me some juicy initial fast facts, like 4 big dramatic love stories and marriages, that she had spent this fascinating time in Russia at the beginning of World War II, and that had led to this incredible collection of Russian imperial treasure, that she had been the heiress to the Post General Foods empire, and that her final home in Washington, D.C., Hillwood, is still open to the public and houses a lot of the treasure and furniture and mementos from her life. And so this friend just gave me the tip, just go visit Hillwood, go dig into this Marjorie Merriweather Post a little bit. And so I did, and boy, I felt like I had walked into this treasure trove of this epic story. I could not believe I did not know all about her. I could not believe that her name is not a household name, that this is a woman who fundamentally changed the American way of life and shaped a century worth of history. And so now how I explain it is sort of like she's the Forrest Gump of the 20th century, in that she was front row in history, having an active hand in shaping all of these historical moments we know about and learn about, and yet so few people know her name. So 6 years later, the book is here. The Magnificent Lives of Marjorie Post. It was a labor of love, and I just loved immersing myself in Marjorie Merriweather Post's story for 6 years.
Well, she is so incredible. And I have to admit, I'm really, really guilty of reading books that are based on historical figures and occasionally having the Wikipedia page up at the same time. And I kept going, wait a minute, she met and surely she didn't. And hold on, she's related to, and she's incredible. You're right. She is the Forrest Gump of the real Forrest Gump of the 20th century, because she just was there for so many significant moments in time, and so many fascinating people came in and out of her life, including, of course, her family and her many, many different love affairs. So we had a few questions about the husbands. So how do you balance a book where you're focusing on the woman at the heart of the book and you want her story to be the main story that you're telling? How do you balance that with the relationships that she had with these men as well, and sort of still center the story on her? Because I noticed the book never slips into, suddenly we're focusing on this man's story or this man's motivations at the cost of her narrative.
That is such a great question, because that was such a challenge for me and such a line to walk, because I've never written about a heroine who divorced. I've certainly written about heroines who were unhappy in their marriages, but because they lived centuries ago, or they were heads of state or whatnot, divorce was just not an option for them. So that was a first. And I had to do that 4 times. And probably even more challenging, though, was the fact that I had to make it compelling for a reader to be willing to come along on 4 different love stories, and to be willing to fall in love 4 times, and to find this compelling and poignant for not only Marjorie, but for the reader to buy in on this journey. And like truly, as happened in the book, some of these love affairs began and were on the way to matrimony in a matter of days. Or you wonder why they were divorces. But so I had to bring the reader along and create buy-in. And so that was a challenge. So four very different love stories, four very different men, and Marjorie evolves through each one of these love stories and each one of these marriages. And so ultimately, what this was for me was, I'm telling this woman's story, and a huge part of her story is her marriages and the children that are the result of these marriages and the opportunities and events that unfold in her life because of these marriages. But ultimately, this is a story that is filled with love, in spite of the fact that there are four not happy endings. But her life was a life that was filled with love, separate and distinctive from these men and these marriages. And ultimately, the central love story of this book is her own journey falling in love with her own voice and stepping into her own power. When we see her the first time she's a bride and she's a teenager and she's naive, it is Edwardian. It is Downton Abbey era.
It really is.
Yeah, she is not empowered. She is not voting. She is not able to take a leadership role in her family's empire, even though she's the sole heir of CW Post. It's always known it's going to be her husband who takes her place at the table. And then you see with each subsequent marriage, she becomes a little bit more outspoken. She finds a little bit more of her own inner core and steps into her values and steps into her voice. By the second marriage, you have the Jazz Age, you have World War I, you have the Great Depression. So you see things becoming a bit more free for women, and you see her evolving. And then by the third marriage, you're in the 30s, it's the FDR administration. You have Frances Perkins in the cabinet, and you have Marjorie really step into her power at that moment, where she takes a seat at the board of directors for her business and is like, no more of this business of my husband taking over for me when I'm smarter and more competent and more capable. And so it's really an evolution for her. And the arc sort of parallels the evolution for women in the 20th century. And so that was what I loved the most.
I think that is absolutely fascinating with her, because you're right. She is across such an interesting time period. And we have a question about sort of modernity and her role in society and all of those things. But I was really struck by how different the world would have been from when she was born, and when you were first seeing those scenes with her family and the Kellogg, Dr. Kellogg, and everything that was going on. And then going to the moment where, she's in Mar-a-Lago, she's meeting presidents, she is influencing people in really fascinating ways, and she is really stepping into that role of, businesswoman, which she was, but in a more maybe soft, passive way than holding the title. She's so interesting in that regard, because she really does provide this insight into sort of what a woman could do and what a woman maybe with a lot of money, but would have been brave enough to do over that period of time.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Mar-a-Lago. By the end of, so a lot of people don't know that Marjorie Merriweather Post built Mar-a-Lago, which is just a fascinating tidbit. And that her goal was always, or her hope was always, to leave it as a winter White House. But you see by the end of her life, when she's planning on that and hoping for that, as you said, she's friends with presidents, she's friends with heads of state. Had she been alive today, I think we'd all want to vote for her for president. But in her lifetime, that just wasn't an option. But she found ways to exert her power and to use her voice. One of my favorites was the moment when she insisted her company buy Bird's Eye frozen foods. And all the men, all the business experts were saying, oh, people don't want refrigerators. People don't want freezers. They don't want to buy frozen foods or refrigerated foods. And she said, I'm telling you, the American woman is ready for this. And in doing so, she fundamentally changed the American way of life and the world food economy. And I don't think people know that about her.
No, it feels like such an important turning point in her life, and in her marriage, of course, as well. But it has this huge impact on everybody. I mean, that is how we live our lives now, is packaging and being able to get winter vegetables in the summer and vice versa. And it's revolutionized everything. It's so interesting that it comes down to this woman in this moment where she decides, no, actually, I'm going to overrule everybody, and I'm going to say this is important.
Exactly. And make millions in the process for her company, which was a great added bonus. But, I have a refrigerator in my home, so I owe that to Marjorie Merriweather Post. And I can't tell you how many readers have connected on that one point saying, I never knew, I never thought, why do I have a refrigerator? I never gave credit to Marjorie Merriweather Post, but she's the one who said women don't want to give days of their lives every fall to canning and preserves. If it means you can have a vegetable in the winter or a glass of orange juice or a cup of instant coffee, the American household is ready for this. And she was right. She had that business instinct because she had been schooled from her girlhood by her father's CW Post, and she understood the business. And the tragedy is that for so long, she was not allowed to be the leader that she was always capable of being.
I want to make sure that everybody knows, please do, just as usual, drop your comments in the live chat. We'll be able to answer some questions. We do have some questions that came in before the live chat, which is always a good way, especially if you can't actually get to the live video and you're going to watch back. And Carol actually did that. She said, I never heard of Marjorie Merriweather Post. I need to be careful and say that in the right order, at the right speed, otherwise I'll mess it up. Until I visited Hillwood a few years ago. Amazing place to spend the day. And then she goes on to say, my overwhelming sense is that MMP was a woman of her time in regards to her homes, her decorating style, her husbands, and her manners. But she was a woman before her time in regards to her strength, her business sensibilities, and abilities. You can't help but wonder what she would be like if she was alive today. And I think that's exactly what we were talking about, right? This is a woman who probably would have taken her business or her political interests or something into a whole nother realm if she had the opportunities that are afforded to women today.
That is such an insightful comment, and that is so right on. And I would agree. And I would just add, I just got home from Hillwood yesterday. I went down there to give a talk to the Hillwood members and readers in the Washington area, and just truly agree. It is a treasure trove. It is so worth seeing. And when you are there, you are just thinking, this feels like a royal palace. but she was a self-made woman. She started with nothing. The family started with her gluing labels on the family's cereal boxes, like grape nuts, the Post foods, in a barn in Michigan, the most humble of origins. And the fact that she acquired all of this in her life and became known as America's Empress. It's just a remarkable, stunning story.
How, with a character like her and knowing where sort of history has gone since her birth, shall we say, how do you balance what you know now about women and women, breaking out into the workforce and politics and all aspects of life? How do you balance that with a character who is historical and get the mix right in terms of showing who she was, in her time and in her place, and how she was also different, but maybe not being too modern about it and putting too much of today onto that character?
Yeah, that's right. Because that she was born in 1887. So she was born almost a century after I was. And so that really matters because a lot happened over that century. But how I did it was I saw history sort of through the lens of her role in it. So we're tackling big stuff over the course of her life, like the First World War, where she's running and funding the largest field hospital in wartime France for the Red Cross. And then the Great Depression, where she is hosting, galas and benefits to raise money and running a food kitchen and a soup kitchen, and with her husband, a different food canteen downtown for the starving people of New York. And then World War II, where she gives her fabulous yacht, the Sea Cloud, which is bigger than JP Morgan's yacht, to serve for $1 a year to the US Navy so that it can be used in the war effort. And so sort of how I saw it was sort of like the American version of The Crown, where we're going on this fascinating tour through history, but through the perspective and the eyes of this remarkable woman who had a hand in shaping all those events. So she was very much a woman of her time, and she evolved. She became a suffragette during the Wilson administration. That was an evolution for her. She was a mother to 3 girls. She cared very deeply that her daughters should have rights and should be able to vote. She spoke out very openly during World War II about the dangers of Nazism, not only because of how terrible Hitler was, but because of how terrible that would mean for women across the world to have the Nazi, patriarchal idea in place for how a family should look and how the role of a woman should look. So she was very much a woman of her time. And so that helped me keep it grounded in that way. And then another really helpful thing was there's a lot that still exists in the historical record that's in her voice. Her letters, her quotes, interviews she gave to newspapers or that family members have related. So I really felt like I got a sense of her tone and her jargon, and the fact that even though she was America's Empress, she was up until the end spoke with this salty, down to earth Midwestern twang and tried to really keep it real and colloquial. And she was funny. She had a sharp sense of humor. So I feel like her personality and her tone really came through for me, and that helped me in walking that line.
Well, you've led right into my next question, which was
perfect.
going to be about
research.
And I
don't even know what it is.
There you go. I am so curious about the research that you did for this book, because again, you are dealing with truly somebody's almost entire lifetime, because we meet her when she's so young, and we go all the way up to the end of her life. And I think it is absolutely incredible, the amount of detail and the different phases of her life. So how do you start tackling?
Oh yeah, this was the hardest book I've ever written, because of what you said. There is so much information out there about her, and she lived a long life, and every single day of her life was incredibly busy. And she, this was not small stuff like World War II, the Cold War, the Great Depression, the Roaring 20s. These were big things, and she had big roles in history in all of these moments. So there was a lot to cover. And what I said to my editor at the beginning was like, I could write 15 different books about Marjorie Merriweather Post, each with its own unique individual arc, and each could be the length of a full book. There's just that much information out there. And, the historical record, when you're writing about someone, as I've done in the past, who's been dead for 300 years, has a lot more holes in it. And that's where the writer of historical fiction gets to work and gets to play. But Marjorie's life is very well documented. And Hillwood, her final home, is a museum with an entire team of curators and archivists and PhDs, where their life's work all day, every day is to preserve her historical record. So it's out there. So it was challenging. But what I would say is the history was just so good, and the raw material was just so good, that, like, as you said, when you Googled things to see, like, did this actually happen? I didn't have to make up the most outlandish, most outsized things, because the historical record just gave me the best nuggets for this story. And so how I would explain it is, the history was it was the bones, it was the characters, it was the dates, it was the events, it's the arc. And then where I'm writing this as a novel and not a biography is where I'm going in and I'm putting on the flesh and the color. I'm imagining the conversations. I'm imagining the dynamics of the relationship. I'm trying to create for the reader what they're seeing when they enter into Marjorie's world. So it was going to all of her homes that I could, reading as much as I could out there, reading the interviews, reading the primary sources, looking at the photographs of her, and really there was a lot. And so I included in my historical note as well all of the books and the places where readers can learn more about her life.
Well, I've noticed that some people have said that they've gone on and read some of those books, and some people have done virtual tours of Hillwood. Some have actually gone to Hillwood. So it's always good, I think, as an author, when you see people responding to that author's note in such a strong way.
Totally.
It's very, very nice.
For you to say that you had to keep the Wikipedia page open, that's amazing, because that means that you were invested and you were taken in, and that's what I do as a reader. So it's very gratifying to hear that from readers.
Well, I have to say, I think my favorite part of the book, my favorite part of her life, was her life in Russia was fascinating. I know very, very little after the revolution and before the Second World War. I know so little about that period of time in Russia. It was just so interesting getting sort of an American perspective on what was going on through that diplomatic lens, because of having to be so careful and so specific with their language and how they presented themselves, but then also for them to have this completely different perspective than the people whose country they were in about the treasure and the value of the items that were being sold to them. It was just fascinating.
It really was. And I, like you, did not know much about that time period at all because the American government did not recognize the Soviets for the first few years of their power because they had murdered the Tsar and his family. And they were openly hostile to the West and openly wanted to export the revolution for all free countries to become communist. So what happened was FDR in the 30s saw the looming clouds of war taking shape over Europe and saw, as bad as Stalin appears to be, the situation for America and for the world would be far worse if Stalin and Hitler are together than if we have the Russians on our side. So FDR normalized relations with the Soviet Union at that time, recognized the Soviet Union, and sent Joe Davies and his wife, Marjorie Merriweather Post, to Moscow as the ambassador and the ambassadress to the Soviet Union. Marjorie was the first ever United States ambassadress to the Soviet Union. As a result, they went to Moscow with the directive, you need to make friends with the Soviets because we need to keep them from aligning with Hitler. And so Marjorie, who is this walking poster child of capitalism and the
you
ultimate,
could not get a more different person.
Loves capitalism. She's the ultimate success story of the American dream, the embodiment of the American dream. And she loves to host and she loves to party and she loves to entertain. And she is sent there to make friends, and she is going to put all of her gifts and all of her energy and all of her talent and all of her resources into this role and into doing what FDR needs her to do, which is charm the Soviets. And they get there and they know they're being trailed by what would become the KGB, by the Secret Service, by the spies. They have Russian spies living in their walls of their home. Like, it was a creepy situation. The only way they could even hope to have a private conversation was if they ran a faucet or tapped something to break up the bugs. But it was crazy. And so Marjorie also was a woman of luxury, and she was going to Moscow in the winter in the time of famine, leaving Mar-a-Lago behind and the subtropics and this life of luxury. And she was like, I'm not going to go in any less style than what Marjorie Merriweather Post is used to. She loads her yacht, the Sea Cloud, with, thanks to her business genius, refrigerators and freezers. And she packs milk and vegetables and bird's eye frozen foods and meat and all these things that they never would have been able to get in the USSR, and furniture, bathtubs. She completely rewires the house. She does a gut renovation. She brings her own domestic staff, and she gets to Moscow, and the Soviets had never seen anything like Marjorie Merriweather Post, and she dazzled them.
She must have been a force of nature. Walking into that world, it must have been just a shock.
Yeah,
a complete shock.
And then, to your point, it was such an interesting time for her to arrive there because the Soviets are starved for cash, and they have sacked and looted centuries worth of treasure from palaces and churches of all of the royals that they've murdered and the royal, aristocracy. And so they're willing to sell this priceless, invaluable treasure, made by Fabergé himself, and, the tea service belonging to Catherine the Great, the diamonds belonging to Anastasia. They're willing to sell it to whoever has cash to buy it. And Marjorie had cash, and Marjorie loved art and appreciated it. And so she was able to save a lot of this treasure that was just sitting in warehouses, collecting dust. And the Soviets really had no use for it. They wanted the money.
It's such an interesting time, and her position in that time is fascinating. I want to make sure we have a chance to get to Susan's comment, because I think this kind of flows in nicely with some of the research questions. So Susan says, did you have any input from surviving family members which influenced the direction of your writing?
Such a great question. So that was also an incredibly new experience for me because I have never written about a woman who had family members who were still alive. The closest I've ever gotten is Facebook messages from descendants of Benedict Arnold who live in Canada, who will say, read The Traitor's Wife and be like, oh, we always knew Peggy was involved. We always knew she was part of it. But there were people, there were scenes that I was writing in this book where the people who were present in those rooms are still alive. So that was a wild thing. And that was also a lot of added pressure because I felt like I wanted to get it right and honor her story. But at the same time, I'm writing a novel. I'm not writing a biography. And so
Yes.
there is artistic license and there is sort of the historical record. That's one rail of the train track, but then the story is another, rail. And sometimes it's running very close to parallel. And sometimes your story, takes you in a certain direction. Like, for instance, in a moment of divorce, you have to pick a side. And I'm writing from Marjorie's perspective. So I'm usually taking her side as opposed to the husband's side, just to give an example.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been connected with various family members. It's been a wild experience and I'm like honored every single time I talk to them. And so far I've heard that they're supportive. They've come to my events. They're enthusiastic. We
That's good to
have
hear.
a nice rapport now. And one thing so Dina Merrill was Marjorie Merriweather Post's daughter, the great talented movie star. And one of Dina Merrill's grandsons said, it's as you said, you didn't have to make anything up. Her life was just truly that outsized. And they're happy. I think they tell me that her name is out there and that her legacy is being celebrated and that people who maybe hadn't heard of her are now getting a taste of her fascinating, meaningful life. And hopefully also another generation now that we didn't grow up with Dina Merrill. We didn't grow up with Marjorie Merriweather Post in our lives. So I really ultimately loved Marjorie Merriweather Post and admired her and liked her and found her so inspirational. So my goal the whole time was for that to come through, that this is a life that I'm honoring and celebrating. And so I hope that they feel it does her justice.
Well, as an outsider, I think it absolutely honors her and all of those things. I think, again, you read this book and you think, how have I not heard of this woman?
Yeah.
Anissa would like to know, what was the biggest hurdle that you had to clear while writing this book? And she says she absolutely loved it.
Oh, thank you. So I think the biggest challenge, and we sort of touched on this a little bit, but just how much to wrangle from the historical record. I felt as though had there been less ground to cover or fewer years to cover, I felt that there were moments I could have zoomed in on and really developed more. And I could have lingered there longer. Like I would have loved to linger with Marjorie and E.F. Hutton in the 1920s in the Jazz Age for longer. But because there was so much to get to, I really had to keep going. And so that was the biggest challenge, was just pacing and touching on everything I wanted to cover without it just feeling like I'm just giving a series of information updates, but making it a story and an immersive narrative.
That question of story. So I've never written a book based on historical figure. I've sort of used some historical figures as jumping off points, but it's always deviated into fiction, fictionalized people from there. How difficult is that balance of trying to construct a narrative out of somebody's life? Because as you said, this is not your first go round with a historical figure. Is there something that you sort of use as that through line for you as an author, trying to get that right and making sure that, as you say, we're not just, historical stops along the way, but we're really pulling through with a real story of this person's life?
That is the challenge when you're writing about a real person. And inevitably, when you're writing fiction that's biographical fiction and historical fiction, you will always hear from people who are experts on this woman and they notice this thing or this thing. And you're always walking this tightrope between telling the story, allowing the story to unfold as an immersive reading experience, but wanting to pass the credibility test and get the history right and do it justice. And so for this, every book has been different, and every single time, it's been its own unique dance to sort of figure it out. But I would say there are two things that have to happen. Number one, I have to be absolutely obsessed with the character, because I have characters in my mind all the time, but to give 6 years of my life to someone and just really steeping myself in their story, researching it, writing it, editing, drafting it, writing it again, editing again, and then talking about it for the rest of my life, hopefully,
Yes.
if readers are interested. I have to really be obsessed. And so I am, and I have been with each of these characters, because that's really what has to happen. And then once I am obsessed, there's this moment that happens where once I've done that huge initial push up front of research, and I have the historical figure pretty well outlined in terms of the facts and understanding the history, there's a moment where the character that is on the page that I'm reading about and researching sort of comes to life and becomes the character that is then the character in my novel. And there's sort of a passing of the baton. And then this person is really becoming a person and starting to have conversations in my head and starting to interact with characters and really becoming a character in my book, as opposed to the character I'm reading about in the biography. And so when that moment happens, I know I'm ready to sit down and write, and I'm sort of off to the races, and the story has to unfold, organically from there.
That's so interesting, that sort of idea of internalizing that character and getting it to the point where, you could put them on the page and they sort of just start going on their own, which,
Yeah,
which
exactly.
I think a lot of people talk about that with their writing, needing to really get to know that character so much that the plot sort of almost in some ways takes care of itself when you're trying to get from emotional moment to emotional moment.
Exactly. You get to know them. And then what happens is, then when I'm writing my first draft, I'm telling myself the story when I'm writing the first draft. I don't know where it's going. I'm sort of going step by step, page at a time. The character is leading me. Then once I have that draft down, going through in the second and third and fourth drafts are figuring out how to tell this story that's in my mind to create that experience for the reader. So yeah, it happens in that way.
Unfortunately, I've lost the comment. It's somewhere in the stream of wonderful comments we have here, but somebody asked, is there a story in your research that you wanted to tell, but you just couldn't fit in the space you were given to write this book? Because as you said, you probably write 10 books about this
question. Yes, there was sort of a side plot that had to do with a character, and it was Marjorie Merriweather Post's niece by marriage to E.F. Hutton. And it was a young lady, and her name was Barbara Hutton. And if you know, poor little rich girl, and she was the heir to the Woolworth Empire. And she was this sort of tragic New York socialite figure. And it was during, as I said, the time that I would have loved to have zoomed in on, the E.F. Hutton years, the 20s and the 30s. But you have Marjorie building Mar-a-Lago. You have Marjorie leading the Great Depression reaction. You have Marjorie moving to Moscow. You have Marjorie possibly being the inspiration for the Great Gatsby in her jazzy Gold Coast of Long Island lifestyle. You have so much going on. And then you have her niece, Barbara Hutton, who is also just fodder for scandal and newspaper in New York high society. And I just felt as though if I were to go there, Barbara could have completely derailed me and taken me in a completely different direction, because her story in and of itself has so much that books are and movies are about her. And so I was like, she kind of takes the energy out of the room when she comes in. So to put her on the page would have been to sort of, she couldn't just be like a cameo. So I just made the decision that I just wasn't going to get into the Hutton side of the family and their scandals, and just was going to stick with Marjorie's story.
You have so much scandal. You can do books and books and books of these. And Barbara Hutton, as you say, she is worth, books in and of herself. She lived a wild life.
Exactly. But then I had, in addition to Marjorie's niece, I had her daughter, Dina Merrill, her daughter, Adelaide, and her daughter, Eleanor. And then they all had children. So there was, just within this one family, there's a lot of ground to cover.
A lot of ground, as you say. Christine asks, did you find something out about Marjorie that surprised or shocked you? She was such a force. Love your book.
Thank you. I found out a lot of things that shocked me. Number one, I was so surprised I already said this, but the bird's eye frozen foods, just that she was so disruptive that she fundamentally changed the American way of life and the diet. I can't hit that point hard enough because I own a refrigerator and I feed my children frozen vegetables. So I am indebted to her. So I loved that about her. I loved just some of the jewelry she had. So this was really fun. I've written about Napoleon. I've written about the Habsburgs with Empress Elizabeth, and I've written about Marjorie, who was America's empress. There was a necklace, a piece of jewelry that Napoleon bought for his empress, Marie Louise, that then would have passed to Desiree's daughter-in-law, who was also named Josephine, named after her grandmother, Josephine de Beauharnais, Napoleon's first wife. So she had it. The Habsburgs would have had it because Marie Louise, the wife, ended up relocating to Vienna and being in the court of the Habsburgs for the rest of her life. So Cece would have had it. And then Marjorie Merriweather Post bought it for herself. So I was like, there is this one piece of jewelry that has made its way through 4 of my books. And that was just like the sisterhood of the traveling jewels. I guess if you're an empress or a queen, you can have pretty good jewelry. So
I was just saying, you got to own the necklace, or you got to own the piece of jewelry. Yeah.
So I loved that. And I just, I loved that the fabulous homes she built for herself. I didn't know that she had originally built Mar-a-Lago. And I also didn't know not only that she was Dina Merrill's mom, but that through marriage to her first husband, she would be Glenn Close's step grandmother. So her first husband, Ed Close, is Glenn Close's grandfather. So I thought that was a fun connection too.
I didn't realize that either, again, until my Wikipediaing, which I really do need to stop doing because I spoil things for myself by accident. It's like looking up an actor's name on a television show and realizing they're only in 1 season out of the 4-season show.
Oh, right. Oh, yeah. You should not do Wikipedia until you finish the book or finish the season. I made that mistake. I think it was Loving Frank where I read and I was like, whoa, did not know that was happening.
Yeah, no, again, real life sometimes can be a lot wilder than we would necessarily make up for our books, because you sit there.
That's why I write historical fiction, because the history is just too good.
It is. And otherwise you sit there and you think, no, my editor, they're never going to go for that. That's just too out there. That's too crazy. And then you read some of this stuff and you think, oh my goodness.
Exactly. It's like, well, okay, I don't need to make up anything.
Yeah, exactly.
History is not boring.
No, it's definitely not. And people who think that haven't been given the right books to read. That's what I'm convinced. There's always a gateway book. So.
Totally. Yeah, they should read more historical fiction.
Yeah, exactly. We have a question from Debbie who asks, which Marjorie did you love the most? Which Marjorie of which phase in her life?
What a great question. And I have never been asked that before.
She does feel distinctive at different points in her life, doesn't she?
Totally. Like even with the cover, when we were talking about the cover art, we were saying, we don't want it to be like clearly Marjorie from the 20s or Marjorie from the 30s. We want it to just feel like it's Marjorie's essence and it's not like definable in one particular decade, because she really did evolve and have these different iterations of herself. So oh my gosh, it's hard to pick because I really did love her all the time, but I loved as she became more self-actualized and she had a deeper sense of just how meaningful her role was and her legacy. I think I probably would say the 30s. I really liked her when she went to Moscow. She was a leader. She was an advocate. She became more outspoken. And then when she's in, since we're doing some spoilers, when you can see that the marriage with Joe Davies, the third marriage, is really falling apart, I loved how she stood up for herself and found her voice in that moment, even though it was devastating for her. So I would probably put it around then. I'll go with like the 50s Cold War era.
So I think that was my favorite, was in the 1930s into that the later part of her life, when you really get a sense that this is a woman who is she's starting to understand how her power and her soft power can be used in a way, and she can really start to claim it. She can really step into her business and her diplomatic work and her philanthropic work. We haven't even talked about the philanthropic stuff, and we have a couple questions about is that park in Long Island or is that place in Milwaukee?
Yes.
but
And
it's
the answer
just
is
so,
yes to all of
the
it.
answer is yes. Yeah, if it has her name on it, it's
Yeah,
definitely one of her
yeah,
things. But it was so interesting reading, this girl who I got the sense when you see her first marriage, I sat there and I thought, this seems really fast and she's really young. And then sure enough, it was really fast and she
yeah,
was really
yeah,
young.
yeah,
But she's almost
yeah.
getting it right and it doesn't quite. But then it's not necessarily that the marriages get any easier, it's that she's starting to control more of her own world and she's starting to make decisions that I thought were really significant for her. And it was really wonderful watching that coming of age story for her within
Yeah.
the book.
You said that so well. I love that. And I agree. And it was a soft power where she realized her power in all of those different facets of life. I really like how you said that.
We got a lot of votes for the Moscow section being big people's
Oh,
favorite. Again,
I love that.
I think it's fascinating and it's just a time that we really don't talk about very much. And then a really interesting role for her as well.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely. I think there's so much fiction out there right now that's about World War II, and this covers World War II, but in a way that is not often the spotlight or the focus of World War II fiction.
Definitely. I think it's just a really interesting thing seeing where there's still gaps in what's being written about in historical fiction,
Mhm.
even just within the first half of the 20th century. There's a lot of stories to be told from a lot of different places, and I'm curious
Yeah.
to see where people go with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
We have a question from Janet, going all the way back to the beginning of the book.
Mhm.
In the beginning, they stayed in the home of Mrs. Gregory to be near the hospital. Was
Mhm.
Mrs. Gregory a real person? And if she was, did she really disagree with the diet that Dr. Kellogg had imposed on Mr. Post?
Yes, and yes. And some of those quotes are real quotes of where she said,
Really?
there's nothing here that will hurt you except fear. And it's true. The whole anecdote about how when he takes the first bite of her food and he really enjoys it, and then he eats more and he clears his plate, and then she leaves food in the ice box. She called it the ice box, and he came down and ate it in the night. That was all directly pulled from the history. And she really did practice Christian Science, and she did not think that the food that Dr. Kellogg was serving at the SAN had any taste or was nutritious enough. And C.W. Post really did feel that his healing happened at her hands rather than at the SAN.
Do you have a sense, or have people speculated about what his condition was, and also what his wife's condition was that
Yeah,
she ended up
yeah.
unfortunately dying from?
They definitely think he had appendicitis. They think he might have had stomach cancer. They think he probably had depression, probably anxiety, and a whole bunch of ailments that we would be able to treat now, like indigestion, and
Sure.
like things, heartburn. And so he probably had a laundry list of ailments, and just felt so strongly that with the power of his mind and his faith, he could cure himself of all of them. And so once he realized that it just wasn't getting better and
Mm.
that he really was ill, he couldn't square the fact that he'd built this fortune and this empire on, if you eat the right foods, you'll be healthy, you'll live forever, with I'm sick, even though I've followed everything I've advocated. And so that they think that that's probably why he took his own life, was just because he was so depressed and um, you know, at the end of his morale was so devastated because of that. And then his wife, and I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't really speak
No,
to
of
what she
course.
had, but certainly she seemed what they called at the time melancholy, just this
Mhm.
pervasive kind of recurring low spirits, and then other medical things that would come up.
It's interesting, and of course, it's so difficult to know now. There's
Mhm.
speculation about so many figures in history and what may or may not have happened to them, and
Yeah.
what they may or may not have been
Yeah.
suffering from. It's a difficult thing to figure
Yeah.
out.
And regardless of what the diagnosis could be now, if doctors could go back and do the autopsy, what was significant for me throughout the story was that Marjorie always claimed and believed that her mother died of a broken heart.
Right.
So whatever that medical diagnosis might have been, that mattered to Marjorie. So that mattered to the story.
Yes, absolutely.
Mhm.
That's where that
Mhm.
character moment is coming from. That makes sense.
Mhm. Mhm.
So
And,
this is
and also just the gutting shock and heartbreak and betrayal that she felt that her father took his life. and just like what a tragedy that was for her. She was in her 20s. She was an orphan. She had millions, and she's left with this stepmother who she has never liked and never trusted, and who she now sees as trying to steal her family's fortune, business, legacy, what was always supposed to have been hers, after having already been the woman who, as she saw it, stole her father from her mother and from their family. And so it was this really foundational sort of trauma that happened for Marjorie very early in her life as a young woman and as a young bride.
Yeah. It's interesting how those moments can really shape a character and shape a real person as well, of course. And she's both in this sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
This is the point in time where I want to be really nosy and ask you about your typical writing routine. And I always laugh a bit when I say typical or typical writing day, because there's never really a typical one, right?
Right, exactly.
In an ideal world.
In an ideal world.
What sort of writer are you? Do you sit down and write every day, or is it a bit of a different process for you?
So I will start this by saying that I'm a mother to 3, and they are 6, 3, and 1. So the ideal world, we're going to really need to lean in to that hypothetical, because it almost never happens. But if my time were my own and I could do, had my druthers, my ideal writing day would be, I'm a morning person. So I would wake up and walk my dog or have some breakfast, get my coffee, and then I like to sit down to my own desk. I'm not a coffee shop writer. I'm not a Panera writer. I like to be in my own space. That way I can keep the coffee and the tea coming. And what's really important for me also is to be able to control the playlist. So I like to listen to music that is in keeping with the theme or the character or the tone of whatever I'm writing. So I like to do that. And then I'll write for a big stretch in the morning, take a break around lunchtime, and then maybe write for a little bit more after lunch. And then by the afternoon, I sort of hit a wall if I've had some good, intense hours. And so then the afternoon would be, in an ideal world, reserved for reading or research or answering emails or like getting caught up on other admin stuff.
I think people forget about how much admin goes into being an author, because you're running a small business, but the small business is you. So it's you who's needed for everything.
Yes, you said it.
I was feeling that very much today as I was trying to be IT and marketing and the person producing the product and all those things.
You're the IT and the on-air persona, and you're doing the social media and the marketing and the PR, and you have to do the substance.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did your writing change during the pandemic? I imagine some of this book must have been written before and then also after as well.
Exactly. It was so interesting. This really was in large part a pandemic book, because I had done all the research pretty much before March of 2020. And the one piece that was still to come was I had my trip planned to go to Mar-a-Lago to do a tour of her home. And I had gotten at that time, like I had spoken to the facilities manager, I'd been cleared and whatnot. And then it was March of 2020 and the world shut down and Mar-a-Lago shut down. And I wasn't about to get on an airplane with 3 small children. And it no longer became an option. So that was her home that I didn't get to make it to, which is okay, because there were enough interviews that I was able to do with people who had been there. There are photographs, there are eyewitness accounts, there are records of how things looked in her time and how it would have felt in her time. But what happened was when everything first shut down in March, all of my kids were home and there was no school and we didn't have any childcare help. We were just all home all the time. So writing became a virtual impossibility. And it was just a really kind of anxious time. And it wasn't like a time that felt like getting the creative juices flowing. It just wasn't really possible. So I really, really worked very hard to finish this book and this draft in those early days and weeks of the pandemic, because I knew, I was like, I don't know how long life is going to feel like this for. And I can't wait for normal to come back, because look, here we are 2.5 years, 2 years later, and it's not back. So I sent out the draft, finished the first drafts that I had of the completed book, and sent it to my editor at that time. Because for me, editing just feels less grueling and arduous than that initial first research writing drafting.
We are
Yeah.
the same. It's the
Yeah.
same thing.
Yeah.
I feel like there's just more, I don't know, brain power,
Yeah.
emotional, something goes into that
Totally.
first draft that's just
Yeah.
different.
More brain power. It's a heavier lift creatively and emotionally. And so I really tried to get that done. So then I did. So then I was editing over the course of the next, few months. And then, you go into this production period where you're working on things like cover copy and the design for the art for the cover and advanced readers and trying to get cover quotes and reviews and setting up your website and the social media. So that stuff I felt like I could do more. It was less like emotionally taxing. And I did that over the course of the pandemic as well. And then it was this interesting time where it came out in mid-February and I'm in New York. Omicron was really, really bad from November up through like a few weeks after New Year's.
Mm-hmm.
In-person stuff for vaccinated and boosted people just started coming back in mid-February, and this book came out February 15th. So I had my first in-person book event for this book that I'd been to for a book event in like 2 years. So that was wild. And then we had this great month of I was able to go to things and see people, and we were safe and we were tested and vaxxed, but we were by and large able to gather. And then my whole family got COVID in late March. So I like really threaded the needle there, and it was good.
Well, I'm very, very glad that your family is doing better. We did have a question about that earlier, and I know you've mentioned on social media, on Instagram, that you guys have gotten COVID, but everybody's on the mend. Is that right?
Yes, everyone's on the mend. We are a family of 5. It's my husband, me, and our 3 daughters. Dave and I both got it. 2 of our daughters did, and 1 of our daughters didn't. And we are all doing better. Thank you.
Good.
It was about 2 weeks where it was a little rough, but everyone's good.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we've had a lot of questions about what you're reading and enjoying right now. And I know that authors can sometimes be way ahead in the publication schedule or way behind in the publication schedule.
Yeah.
So is there anything in particular that you want to shout out right now?
Yeah, about what I'm reading?
Exactly.
Yes. So I just finished last night Bookends, which is a memoir by Zibby Owens that's coming out this summer. She's a big book blogger and podcaster and influencer. And she's also written her own children's books. She's been an editor for multiple anthologies, but this is her first book that she's written as a nonfiction memoir. So that was beautiful. I read that as an advance copy, as you said, way ahead of the publication process. And then now I'm reading Cloud Cuckoo Land by Anthony Dare, from the author who wrote All the Light We Cannot See. And that is like 600 plus pages. I'm on page like 530. So I'm slogging my way through that.
You're almost done.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And I'm always reading for blurbs too, for pre-pub copies for authors. So I've got a few of those going. And I'm always reading children's books to my 3 girls.
I was going to say, of course. Is there anything historical children's books that are
I love the series Little People, Big Dreams, where they do profiles of these amazing women from history. So we have a book for it, and it's perfect for my 6-year-old and my 3-year-old. It's on their level, their picture book. But they're read aloud with an adult, or my 6-year-old could probably read them at this point. But it's like we have Rosa Parks, we have Amelia Earhart, we have Emmeline Pankhurst, we have Marie Curie. They just write these great women, and they're like children's books, biographies of these characters. So we do a lot of those.
That sounds really charming and really interesting. Also, maybe an idea for a new project in there somewhere.
Yeah, they love them, and I love them, and I feel like I learn as I read them.
There you go. It's the best of all the worlds, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Are you able to talk about your next project, or is that still something that's behind the scenes?
It is so behind the scenes, and I'm in the process that you and I were talking about of like pushing the boulder up the hill with the very heavy lift of the first draft. I'm almost done with the first draft. I have about 110,000 words. Like I'm really close to finishing this first draft. And I just spoke about it for the first time 2 days ago, because I was at Hillwood, which is Marjorie's home, and they asked me what I'm working on next. And I was like, well, how do you top Marjorie? But I'll just say it here, even though I don't know. I like,
It's
I'm
that weird
so,
thing of like, should I, but shouldn't I?
I
I
know
know
I
the
feel
feeling.
so coy and protective before I'm like ready to really go. But it's this fascinating woman. Some people know the name, some people really don't, but her name was Margaret Fuller, and she was this fascinating woman. Concord, Massachusetts, mid 1800s. There is this genius cluster of Louisa May Alcott, Nathaniel Hawthorne, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Herman Melville, all of these writers who are giving us this, the greatest decade of American literature, like The Scarlet Letter and Little Women and Moby Dick and Walden Pond. And there was this fascinating leading lady at the center of this whole little clique, and her name was Margaret Fuller, and she was fascinating. She changed history, she changed culture, she changed American life, and yet not that many people know her name. They know all the other names of all the
I
other
was going
people
to
who she was
say,
with. So I'm obsessed with her story.
oh, fantastic. Well, now I never want to put pressure on a fellow author, but I'm very excited about it.
But don't go to Wikipedia yet.
No. I'll save myself. I'll wait for the book.
Thank you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, we one last question. We had
Mm.
a lot of questions about if it's possible to get signed book plates or
Yes,
signed copies of your books.
yes,
Is there somewhere
absolutely.
doing that for you?
Absolutely. So signed books are available if you order online. Split Rock Books in Cold Spring, New York. So it's Split Rock Books, SPLIT, Split Rock, ROCK Books. If you go to their website or you call them, they can get signed copies. Then additionally, I believe Foxtail Books, which is a great indie in the Atlanta, Georgia area, they have signed copies, Foxtail. And like these places would ship, obviously, if you call. And then the bookstore at Hillwood, which is her home. So if you look up Hillwood House and Gardens, it's the museum Hillwood in Washington, D.C. It was Marjorie Merriweather Post's home. Their bookshop, their gift shop has a bunch of signed books as well. So I would say try, you can, that way you're supporting local, you're supporting small
Yes.
businesses. And I believe that those are the three places that currently have signed stock. Oh, and Palm Beach Bookstore, right in the shadow of her home. She was the leading lady of Palm Beach. They, I believe, have signed stock as well. So Palm Beach Bookstore.
Okay.
And they're all like local small businesses.
Fantastic. So people will be able to track those down.
Yeah,
There have been a lot of questions about that.
yeah.
So I'm glad we're able to point people in the
And
direction
you can call and blame me and say the author told me this is where I could get a signed book. So if you don't have them, let Allison know because she promised, and I'll give them more signed stock that way.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, where can people find you online to make sure that they're
Absolutely.
following news about the next
Yeah.
book, all of that?
I love connecting with people. So please do find me. So my name is Allison Pataki, Allison, Pataki, Pataki. There it is. And so if you go to my website, it's just my name, AllisonPataki.com. And then on Instagram, I'm Allison Pataki. On Facebook, Allison Pataki. Twitter, Allison Pataki. It's all, that's the spelling. And that's where I am.
Well, thank you so much for doing this with us and doing our first YouTube adventure while in between laptops and iPads.
You did it. You had to be tech and IT and talent, and
it's all the glamour.
Yeah, you did it. You nailed it.
Wonderful. Well, thank you guys. We will be back for more reading next month. And until then, I hope you enjoy whatever is on your nightstand.
Thanks,
everybody.
Bye.